this Kali Tribune project, we very often talk or write about what is called sustainable development, an ontology and political philosophy that comes under different names sometimes and under different guises. In this episode, we'll revisit sustainable development one more time, but in the context that I believe is not being often put forward by people who are aware of dangers of sustainable development, albeit often under different name. Today they like the name Great Reset or degrowth, but that's not important. It's all the same ontology and the same political theory and practice. We'll put sustainable development in the context of Karl Marx and Marxism. The reason why I'll attempt to do that is because American critics, mostly American critics and British critics maybe of sustainable development, or to a man or to a woman indeed, tend to identify sustainable development with A, socialism, or B, Marxism itself, or in the synthesis of A and B in communism. To say at the outset, I think this proposition is not only ill-informed, it is downright wrong to its core. Namely, sustainable development and Marxism share precious little common ground, for one thing. Moreover, sustainable development is something that Karl Marx, I don't mean Marxist, but precisely Karl Marx, would outright reject. And in his lifetime, he rejected some ideas that are now incorporated in sustainable development. To understand what this is about, we'll have to talk a bit about the German philosophy, a classical German philosophy, or classical German idealism as it is often called, which is the birthplace of Marx and his ontology, his metaphysics. That is because Marx does have metaphysics. It is atheist materialist metaphysics that is at the core of his economic and political theories. Some assumptions that he was quite open about, but were not accessible that much to a reading public until early 20th century from his early philosophical writings. We'll revisit some of these ideas here because I'm trying to talk about principles here. Principles of sustainable development on the one hand, and principles of Karl Marx and correspondingly Marxism on the other hand. They don't jive, to say in advance and to say the least. Now, what is the main philosophical problem for Karl Marx and why he indulges into his intellectual pursuit that gave birth to Marxism and communism, socialism and communism? Well, this is the problem of the opposition of the freedom and necessity. This is the one way to put it. There are other ways to put it, but they could be, I think, understood as convertible. Now, for those in the know, this is already clear. I'm talking about German classical philosophy. And this is the main problem of German classical philosophy. And although Marx is a critic of German classical philosophy, to wit Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, he is also its beneficiary and its direct descendant, roughly belonging to a group called young Hegelians, or to be even more precise, left Hegelians. The conflict or the opposition of the necessity and freedom in fact originates in Kant's philosophy, but to understand it in a kind of from kind of bird's view, that is to say how it can be applied to any and all thinkers of that age, and indeed I do think it can, it's best to put it in the terms of the relation of subject and object, which is crucial for German classical philosophy, but modern philosophy in general. Although German philosophy was most self-aware philosophy of its time. By this I mean Germans were aware what they see as a problem and what consequences this state of affairs has for philosophy and indeed for mankind in general, because that was a time when people still thought that ideas matter. As a matter of fact, they still do, but different. Now we have to deal with different ideas, and ideas I would even add of quite a lower quality. And it was a case in the times from Kant to Hegel. Now, subject-object split is, roughly speaking, split between conscious I as a personal pronoun, and everything that is in some way other than that I. Why would we call it, excuse me, conflict between freedom, let's say opposition, not necessarily conflict, between freedom and necessity? Because I is by its very definition, if put into this context of opposition of I and not I, free. At least it is understood. It's been understood as such in modernity. The problem, therefore, is how I can acquire the objectivity and hence the unshakable reality it encounters in the world that is opposed to it. And consequently, how the world, real as it gets, opposed to the free I, can itself be resolved into freedom and shown to be something that is also subjective, that is also imprinted by the sigil of consciousness or reflective I. Now, my repeating of this I, that may sound funny, is unfortunately necessary, because I is not a person. And this is something that is very important to bear in mind. We won't get into this here. There are other places I talked or wrote about it. And this is I is a consciousness, and consciousness is something that is very, very well defined, especially in German philosophy. So this is the problem that was encountered by Marx, and that was put forward in Marx's opinion to a perfection of the given historical circumstances in Germany by Hegel. And Marx was pronouncedly Hegelian, because in German idealism you had other thinkers like Schelling, for instance, who went beyond Hegel in some aspects, which Marx didn't care much about. So to understand Marx on a long way to reach sustainable development and definitions, if there are indeed any definitions in the ontology of sustainable development, we have to say a few words about Hegel. So strap, that is to say, fasten your seatbelts for a slow and bumpy ride. Hegel had put this problem of subject and object into a very clear framework. Now, Hegel is famously difficult to read philosopher. He is considered as such. English interprets after Bertrand Russell and analytic philosophy just tend to ridicule him. But Hegel's difficulty in Hegel is because he's, as every true philosopher, he is finding extreme profundity and complexity in simple things, whereas finding simplicity in complex things in a way that is not really natural, like it was in antiquity and Middle Ages and in general in pre-modern philosophy, but is conditioned by this, what I consider artificial subject-object split. By the way, just to put forward my opinion, I consider subject-object split illusory problem. But nevertheless, this is the problem of modernity. It is very much tied to modern age, and historical assumptions of modern age, by the way, it's unthinkable without them. However, with the pretension to be proposed as something eternal, which was always present, which is absolutely not the case. But this is not important for our subject directly, because we won't criticize at this point. Hegel put it, this is the reason why Hegel is difficult. Hegel is interested in a way of reconciling subject and object, I and reality, freedom and necessity, to make freedom necessary and to make necessity free. And in this pursuit, he perhaps went the furthest from all the German idealists, in the sense that he never abandoned idealism, which for Germans of that age was not idealism, what we think today of Plato's idealism. There were no isms in Plato's time, and this is very important, but something that is very clearly defined, and as we shall see. Hegel, to understand what Hegel means by this reconciliation, the German word is Versöhnung, because the purpose of the whole process of interactions, dialectical interactions of subject and object, of spirit and the world, of I and the world, is Versöhnung, the reconciliation of opposites, not simply abolishment in some kind of drastic, even violent way, which is, by the way, the case in Marx, but by reconciliation. And this is a Christian term. Hegel is using, Hegel's philosophy has been understood by him as Christian philosophy. It has to do with Christianity and Christian philosophy of traditional sense absolutely nothing. It is using the framework, framework of Christianity, completely empty of content, in my opinion, and turns into atheism on a cue, because it is atheistic at its core. But this is not a precise subject here. I'm just putting a little audio mental footnote for you to consider. But this is very important, because this gives you a feel for Hegel, because Hegel is very much criticized. I think you see how that I am also ambivalently disposed towards him, but he's also profoundly intelligent. He was profoundly intelligent man and capable as a philosopher. Although I would agree with Eric Vogelin's diagnosis, so to call it, that Hegel was in fact Gnostic. For those who don't know what Gnosticism is, in Eric Vogelin's optics, I unfortunately cannot go into that now, but I'll explain what is the Hegel's notion of knowledge and just point out that it is not philosophy. In the Phänomenologie des Geists, phenomenology of spirit, by some, and notably by Marx, the most important Hegel's book, and one of his first books, his first major published work from 1807, Hegel puts forward as his task, and the task of indeed of his age, to abolish philosophy in a certain sense. As Hegel says in paraphrase, philosophy consists of philein and sophia, that is to say, a friendship or love towards wisdom, which implies by the very nature of expression, but also by historical accounts of its origin in Pythagoras, angeblich, and others, implies a discrepancy between desire of knowledge, of Sophia, of wisdom, and the wisdom itself. Implication is that it is not fully attainable to humans, and this to human beings, to men, and occasional women. The thing is that this is really a staple of philosophy for ages, for metaphysics, for most ambitious forms of metaphysics maybe. There is no identification of man and sophos, the wise, in the absolute sense of the word. This was always more or less given to God himself, or even gods in later Platonism and such. Hegel wants Sophia without philein, and Phenomenology des Geistes is a book that tries to show how spirit, and spirit is the synonymous with I, the subject, through the series of experiences in time, in history, not only history of man, but also history of nature, which Hegel doesn't find that important, tries to jump over it, comes to self-consciousness. And in this self-consciousness acquires wisdom without philein, and that wisdom is absolute knowledge. Now, what does it mean? Absolute knowledge is not possible if you are forever stuck in the discrepancy between subject and object. I can never penetrate the full intelligibility of things that are outside of me. So that Hegel would argue we're all subject-object conditioned thinkers, therefore more or less everybody in the academic world today. I cannot really grasp it fully because our essence is alien. We are alienated and fremd. Entschuldigung, sorry. This is very Entfremdung, alienation. This is very important term. Those who know their Marxism are already aware why I'm kind of underlying it here. The very existence of the subject and object implies alienation because they are opposites. And they are, on the other hand, opposites that cannot exist without each other. You cannot have subject without object, you cannot have object without subject. It's their being, their common being, commonality. The only sure commonality between them is a relation. And what Hegel wants to show, and what would be really fulfillment of Sophia, of absolute knowledge, would be to show that this relation is in fact not relation of opposition, but reconciliation and unity. And this is what he tries to do. Now this is, I think you can only guess, pretty ambitious. Yeah, one has to mourn for the times that people could have this kind of flights of fancy into their heights of their own abilities, that when they believed that they can practically solve the mystery of existence and that they had even very high political influence while thinking that. That's why we in 20th century had totalitarian ideologies, but that's a separate question. Anyway, Hegel wants reconciliation of subject and object. This reconciliation is self-consciousness. Why self-consciousness? Well, because self-consciousness, self-conscious being, is the being that is at the same instance subject and object. It's subject in the sense that it is conscious, it is object in the sense that it is self-conscious, it is conscious of itself. This being is what Hegel calls Geist, or spirit. The purpose of the existence of this world and everything in it is for spirit to become self-aware. Moreover, spirit to become self-aware as the real spirit, concrete spirit, as Hegel would say. Concrete spirit is such spirit that whose self-consciousness is recognizing itself in its own object. This means what Hegel wants to show, that both nature and both cultural, spiritual products of humanity are in fact products of spirit. And spirit that is in fact coming to consciousness of itself through time, through history, through gradual steps. Phenomenology was an attempt to demonstrate some of these steps in its initiatory phase, to keep matters as short as possible, not to go into too much directions at the same time. I'll just extract one very famous fragment of phenomenology, des Geistes, of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, which demonstrates how he thinks and which was very important for Karl Marx. And this was the so-called master-slave dialectics, which in Hegel's view is the birthplace of consciousness, historical birthplace of consciousness. Now, when Hegel says that subject is present in object, albeit unaware at some instance of this fact, he really does mean this applies to nature. The laws of nature and such are in fact subjective creations, not in the sense that people just make them up, but because subject cannot, objects, inhuman objects cannot exist as comprehensible without a framework of natural laws, for instance. Not causes, by the way. Hegel is modern thinker. Causes don't apply here, just laws. Be they Newtonian. Hegel didn't like Newton, but he liked Goethe's understanding, or Leibniz's. But this was more or less the thing. He considered them something that subject creates, because the law is the expression of intelligence, not of non-intelligence and non-sentience. Also, information, things that we in our own day and age would try, for instance, if we are misguided, to understand as works of intelligence, as it is done, for instance, in New Age, this pop New Age philosophy, which is nevertheless very popular with the United Nations and their sustainable development advocates. Let us not forget, where world is understood as a kind of digital system, which is the case in sustainable development, as we shall see. But when they say, for instance, that everything that is bearing the stamp or sigil of information, that means some kind of intelligence. In Hegel, this is far more concrete. But what Hegel wants is to make a leap from the nature to human society in history, because the nature of spirit, in Hegel's view, is something very similar, activity very similar to observing oneself in the mirror. For instance, eye observes itself in the mirror and cannot observe itself in any other way except having something outside it that mirrors it back to itself. That's self-consciousness. You have to look in the mirror. Spirit has to look in the mirror. And this means go out of itself in its gaze, to see itself in the mirror, and then recognize that he is really seeing its own reflection, and this means returning to itself. This is the structure this is Neoplatonic structure or Platonic structure of prohodos, nein and epistrophe, of coming out, staying and returning of the effect into first cause. But it is completely perverted in Hegel, because this subject-object discrepancy does not exist in Neoplatonism, and they think something completely opposite, in fact. But the pure structure, he just takes pure logical structure of Platonism and, in fact, misuses it. But this is the way, just to know that this is the way how his logic works and how his phenomenology works. So the spirit has to recognize itself in its opposite, and this opposite is in a gradual way becoming more and more truly identical with it, because there is a gradation. If spirit sees itself in the nature, in natural laws, in a way the nature operates, this is very low level of self-consciousness. But seeing itself in other spirit, that is to say, other self-conscious being, is a first step towards real identity, because I see myself as a consciousness. I best see myself as such in other consciousness. So the human relations, human society, and human history are the true medium of self-awareness of the spirit and historical process of Versöhnung, of reconciliation of subject and object. And the first instance of this, the start of history, if you will, as dialectics of master and slave. Now, how come this comes about? In Hegel's view, the first conscious relation of human beings is a fight to the death. It is a struggle. Now, this struggle is something that would correspond to Thomas Hobbes' state of nature. Hegel has in mind the whole modern philosophy before him, not only German philosophy. He was very, very well aware of Hobbes, of John Locke, social contract theorists, and so on. But this state of nature, this state of struggle, is not. He's not explaining it in terms of some kind of Darwinism before Darwinism. No, he considers it such because of the need of spirit. Spirit needs to see itself as spirit. So man tries to affirm himself as spirit in a sense that he gains recognition from other spirit. And first act of recognition is win in a struggle, because this is kind of like what corresponds to deeply barbaric state of early nations, at least in this 19th century view, where this struggle for survival, not for survival itself, but survival as self-affirmation. A self-affirmation is a spiritual truth, as Hegel would put it, of the struggle to survive. So it has a purpose, it has a meaning. The reason why this does not work, why this needs another step in development of spirit, is because the victory in the struggle to death is a destruction of the one that is recognizing you. Recognition has to be stable, or another way to put it, absolute recognition. That you cannot go you cannot lose anymore. You are recognized, and that's it. And how to be recognized? You are recognized permanently. Therefore, not in struggle, but in the creation of the basis of the society, and basis of the society is creation of the master and slave. Master in his victory in the struggle to survival keeps the slave as his permanent reminder that he is a human being, in fact, that he is, excuse me, this was quite mistaken, self-conscious spirit. So one spirit exists in two opposite beings, master and the slave. The history of the world, Hegel would say, is the liberation of slaves. The reason why is this so? Because slave is the one who is keeping his creative and primary relation to the world constantly, whereas master is not. This primary relation to the world is work. As the subject-object split is ever permanent in Hegel's view, any kind of relation, anything that world can give you as a self-conscious spirit, is that which you put into it. You have to work on it. The work on the world, the transformation of the world, accordance to the subject, is the first act of self-consciousness. In fact, once the society has been created, once the history has been initiated. Paradoxically, the slave is the one doing that, whereas the master only enjoys the fruits of that labor, losing this moment of consciousness from which there arises the realization of freedom of the subject towards object. Because freedom, work, creative work that transforms nature constantly, that makes nature practically a slave to the human and not other way around, is something that is accomplished by slave. And therefore the other phases in history of consciousness are a liberation of slaves, most notably in Christianity, as Hegel saw it, where God is in every man is identified with embodied God in a certain sense, deserving of absolute freedom, absolute right. But that's a story in itself. So this part of podcast will be concluded here just with two notes. One note on Marx, one note of sustainable development. Why am I saying this? Because as some of you already probably know, work as an essence of man, but the only and exclusive essence of man, which is without parts, completely simple, is Karl Marx's position. It was not Hegel's position. In Hegel, work is one of the aspects of one of the operations of the essence of consciousness in general. In Marx, this is it. Now you can already assume that this master-slave dialectics is very important for Marx, but also that human influence on the world is of paramount importance for Marx, because Marx is a humanist, absolute humanist, in a sense that he rejects what Hegel affirmed, that there is some kind of hyperhuman or suprahuman quality to the spirit, although it is manifested through humans. In Marx, there is no such thing. There is only human being that is alienated from itself, alienated from fruits of its labor. We'll talk about it in the other episode. So this is the point where Marx picks up. And now sustainable development, just to say in advance, and this is very important, in sustainable development, subjectivity, human subjectivity, consciousness, any form is submitted to objectivity. If we are to talk in the subject-object relations, i.e., the human influence in the world has been seen as mostly desultory and destructive. Sustainable development, as I shall try to show, is an ontology that is oriented on objects, not on subjects. It works on the subject-object split because it cannot escape it, as nothing cannot escape this self-destruction of modernity. But from the other way around, then Hegel and Marx, especially Marx, as we shall see, because it is objectifying the subject. In sustainable development, to cut one tree to save hundreds of lives of people, to make them warm, is a crime. In Marxism, for example, in Marx, and please remember, trees will become important later on when we talk about Marx, because this is exactly the problem of human beings dealing with forest and trees was very important for Marx for developing some of his early ideas, core ideas of alienation of civil society and absolute unacceptability of private property. But in Marx, to burn the forest to warm one human being is something that is matter of course. Now these two views, Marxist and Hegelian on the one hand, and sustainable, are completely opposed and cannot be reconciled in no way, shape or form. But of course, that will be subject of our second episode. Thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic of Hali Tribune signing out.